Who wants to look at a thread on the Vorsh subreddit? It's going to be epic. Actually, I think this is an excellent example of a few things. One is how people who don't know anything like see an idea for the first time and immediately have like a visceral gut reaction to it without actually looking into it at all. And they just assume that they're correct. Another is the weaponization of anti-Semitism allegations, where people who themselves are engaging in incredibly anti-Semitic practices, like, for example, equating Israeli with Jew, accuse others of anti-Semitism because they change the word Israeli to Jew. They do it themselves. And it's like, wow, if you try and make it out like they're referring to all Jews, it sure sounds different, doesn't it? Another thing is how completely insane, like, streamer fans are. Like, streamer friends will abandon any position that they hold, any principle that they hold, and streamers themselves do this too, if they think that they can use it against another streamer or another internet personality who that streamer dislikes. Vorsh's community calling people anti-Semitic for denouncing Israel, when Vorsh called for Israel to be nuked off the face of the earth because of the problems that it causes for the region for Palestinians. For one, I'll tell you here, none of those things are anti-Semitic. Vorsh was just being emotional. Rightfully emotional. Everyone should be that emotional for Palestine. But it just goes to show, like what he did was infinitely worse than anything I've ever said about Israel. But it's not. His own community doesn't consider it to be anti-Semitic. His own community doesn't do the thing where you replace the word Israel with Jew like they do for me. So anyway, let's take a look at this thread. Bad Empanada calls a Jew who doesn't live in Israel a Nazi because she spoke Hebrew. He then doubles down. All right. Let's read the tweets. The first thing in this chain. And I promise you there's more to this than just me complaining about Twitter drama. Because this is an example of wider things regarding weaponized anti-Semitism. And we're also going to talk about the construction of the Hebrew language later on. This person said to me, basically, I wouldn't be laughing about Westerners as an Australian. So using Australian as an insult. Australian, a settler colonial citizenship / nationality, okay? I replied, oh my God, are you Israeli? Holy shit, actual Lebensraum colonist. Absolutely. So this is two proportional insults. One, calling someone Australian negatively. Settler colonial nationality, that's fine. You're an Australian. Nothing wrong with that. Australian. That's a good insult, actually. Calling people Australian is a fantastic insult. And then I replied to them basically off the exact same thing. A settler colonial nationality. You are an Israeli. There you go. Those are proportional insults. Someone insults me, firstly, based off my settler colonial citizenship, I insult them proportionally based off their settler colonial citizenship. The only way that you can think that this is bad is if you think like Israel is some sort of magical special nationality that is different to others. That in of itself is pretty anti-Semitic. You know, I consider Israelis to be no different than like, well, they're in a more like in-your-face stage of settler colonialism, so it is more notable. But, you know, Israelis aren't like any different to like United States Americans, Australians, Canadians, you know, other settler colonial nationalities. It's just settler colonial states. The only difference is that Israel, rather than claiming to be a white ethno-state, claims to be a Jewish ethno-state. So proportionately, these are the exact same thing. You can't argue this point. There's no way to argue against this, against like calling someone an Israeli as an insult, a bad thing, like an especially bad thing compared to calling them an Australian as an insult, unless you think that Israel is a special nationality. And it's not. Next thing. Like the person who insulted me for being Australian says to me, do you have literally any proof that either of us support Israel? Well, do you have any proof that I support Australia? No, obviously. I denounce Australian settler colonialism all the time. So again, you can be Australian even if you don't support the Australian settler colonial project. It's pretty simple. It's a citizenship, right? You can be Israeli in the same way even if you don't support Israel. To call someone an Israeli is not anti-Semitic. It's not is it anti-Australian for them to call me Australian based off my citizenship? Obviously not. That's a ludicrous notion. So this person doesn't need proof that I support Australia to call me an Australian as an insult, right? So I don't need proof to call them of them supporting Israel to call them Israeli as an insult. Pretty simple. And then their response is, neither of us live in Israel. Okay, I don't live in Australia. Big fucking deal. This person and me, we are in the exact same situation. I don't live in Australia, yet they called me an Australian as an insult. I mean, that's totally fine. Nothing wrong with that. I left Australia. I'm still an Australian in my citizenship, right? This person is an Israeli who left Israel. They're still an Israeli. Literally the exact same thing as me. We both come from settler colonial states. We're citizens of settler colonial states. Somehow it's magically anti-Semitic for me to insult them in the exact same terms that they're insulting me. It literally makes no sense whatsoever. Like, the only way that you can think that these insults are proportionally different is if you are anti-Semitic, if you associate the very notion of being Jewish with Israel. Now, I don't, okay? I don't equate Israeli with Jew. You might. In that case, I think you might want to look into your own anti-Semitism there, my friend. And like, why is this bad? I called them a Nazi. And so what? Israel is absolutely a Nazi-like settler colonial state. Nazism was a project of settler colonialism based on the concept of Lebensraum, meaning living space, meaning the expulsion of the native population of territory that they planned to and did conquer in order to implant German settlers. That's literally Israel. It's also literally the USA, it's literally Australia, etc. These countries are countries of Lebensraum colonists. If that offends you, I'm sorry that you're offended at the truth. It's still not even remotely anti-Semitic. It might be anti-Semitic if someone was like, no, only Israel is a settler colony. You know, you can't say to someone who denounces settler colonialism constantly, who calls himself a settler even, who just literally said that Australia is also a Lebensraum settler colony, you can't say to that person that they're anti-Semitic for applying the same terms to Israel, which is the exact same sort of country. Like, they think they don't need to provide any evidence, any argument for their opinion. Bad empanada calling to Jewish people, this is where it changes, right? You change the word Israeli to Jewish. You change Israeli to Jewish, and suddenly, denouncing settler colonialism is anti-Semitic. This is how this shit works. Now let's dissect this, okay? Bad empanada calling to Jewish people. The word Jewish was never mentioned, only Israeli. Speaking Hebrew, modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew is not the same thing as liturgical biblical Hebrew. Israeli colonialists, yeah, they are literally Israelis. If I am an Australian colonist, they are Israeli colonists. I don't live in Australia anymore. They don't live in Israel anymore. So what? Let's be consistent here. Now let me explain this, because these people loved, the way that the Zionists work is they change words around, they change what was said, and they deny history constantly. If you see someone speaking conversational Hebrew, the chance that they are Israeli is more than 95%, because 95% of Hebrew speakers live in Israel. Hebrew is a language that was specifically constructed, modern Hebrew, specifically constructed for the Israeli nationalist project. That's a fact. Even aside from that, constructing a language is not a bad thing in of itself. The bad thing, and speaking a language also isn't bad in of itself. The only reason why I brought that up is because it's 100% reasonable to think that someone who speaks modern Hebrew conversationally, as this person was, is if they're Israeli. There's nothing wrong with that. 95% of people who speak Japanese are Japanese. If you saw someone speaking Japanese, is it racist to assume that they are Japanese? Of course not. No. You see someone speaking Japanese on Twitter, you can assume that they're Japanese, and that's not racist. Of course. You see me typing in Twitter in Argentine Spanish, you can assume that I'm Argentine. There's literally nothing about that is racist. How is it anti-Semitic to assume that someone speaking modern Hebrew conversationally, something that most Jews outside of Israel do not do? How in the fuck is that racist? Where is the distinction here? Someone tell me. Is it because modern Hebrew is religious? They say that, by the way. Let's look at what other tweets are there? Yeah, Hebrew is a constructed language specifically created for Israel. We're going to get into exactly how that is. Don't worry, I have many academic sources explaining this. All Israelis are settler colonists currently doing 19th century style settler colonial genocide. Yeah, they are. How can you possibly refute this? They literally are. They are in the 19th century stage of settler colonialism. They have yet to completely dominate their indigenous population. They've yet to completely get rid of them, to replace them completely. They're still there. They're still trying to do that. They're in the process of the stage of settler colonialism that the USA, Australia, etc. were in the 19th century. That is a fact. If Israel is a settler colonial state, that means that Israelis are settler colonists. It's so simple. You can't have settler colonialism without colonists. What the fuck are they talking about? This is a factual statement. What, you said all Israelis are colonists? Yes, I did. They literally are. All white Americans are colonists too. All white Australians are colonists. I am a colonist. The second that you stop taking statements of material facts, statements of how your state works, statements about you as moral attacks rather than simple facts about you, undeniable facts about you. Proletariat is an insult. Bourgeois isn't an insult either, though it should be. These are simple material observations of your standing in relation to the society that you live in. Like the idea that it's anti-Semitic to say that Israelis are settler colonists doing 19th century style colonial genocide is absolutely insane. The idea that it's anti-Semitic to compare them factually, materially doing something that is incredibly analogous to the Nazi Lebensraum project of settler colonial replacement of indigenous populations. The idea that that is anti-Semitic is absurd. Israelis who claim to be the representatives of Jews do not get a special pass to do the same things that were done to them previously because of the Holocaust. If anything, they should know better than anyone else. The idea that you can't compare them to the Nazis, even when they are materially doing something that is incredibly similar to Nazism, using rhetoric that is incredibly similar to Nazism, you can't compare them because of the Holocaust, is completely fucking ludicrous and absurd. Especially because these people like to say, for example, that indigenous people want to do genocide against white people. How is that okay? If my comparison here isn't okay, how is you saying that indigenous people are going to do what was done to them to white people not okay? You're making the exact same comparison, by the way, infinitely less valid because that's not even happening and no one wants that to happen. But Israel is actually doing it. Israel is doing the same thing that was done to many refugees from the Holocaust who fled to Israel. They're doing it to Palestinians. They're not literally industrially murdering Palestinians, sure, but they are trying to replace them with settlers of the correct ethnicity, just as the Nazis wanted to do, and as they did actually do. So there's no possible rebuttal here. I'm sorry, you can't argue with this. Last one. Calling a Jew an Israeli for speaking Hebrew is anti-Semitic. If you see someone, again, this is the same exact thing. If you see someone speaking modern Hebrew conversationally in everyday conversation, there is a 95% chance they are Israeli. Okay? Literally nothing wrong with that. Before we get into the history of Hebrew, let's look at the comments. I'm sure there's some fun ones. All Israelis are blood and soil Nazi settlers, bad empanada. What a dumb fuck anti-Semite. I would love this person to hop on stream and try to explain that to me. Try to explain how comparing a project of settler colonialism to another project of settler colonialism makes you anti-Semitic. I would love them to try to explain that. The only way that this idea that calling Israel's blood and soil Nazi settlers is anti-Semitic works is if you equate Israeli with Jew. So ironically, this person here is clearly doing that and is clearly an anti-Semite themselves. This is no different to saying like, oh, you said Americans are settler colonists? You said Americans are blood and soil Nazi settlers? What a dumb fuck anti-white racist. Does that make sense to you? Obviously not. This is the thing with these anti-Semitism allegations. The anti-Semitism allegations only work if you consider Israel as some sort of special category of state that needs to be treated with like kids' gloves. And that alone is an anti-Semitic notion. There's nothing special about Israel. Israel is another bog-standard European-style settler colonial state. The anti-Semites are the one who try to treat it in a special way and to take things that are not anti-white or anti-Australian, anti-American, anti-Japanese or whatever, when applied to those countries, and claim that they are anti-Semitic only when you apply those exact same standards to Israel. That is anti-Semitism. Like literally none of these people has they cannot explain how this is anti-Semitism. I would love for any of them to come on the stream, look at these tweets and try to explain. They just express offense at being called settler colonists. Look, this is what they do. This one says in all caps, oh, he's saying all Jews are Nazis. Excuse me, where was that said? This is so revealing about how they operate, both in how they're willing to completely change language. They change Israeli to Jew, for one. And it clearly shows that they equate Israel with Jew. That is incredibly fucking anti-Semitic. You look at this and you cannot deny the anti-Semitism. Open anti-Semite calls Jews Nazis. You see, you look at the Israeli state, what it's actually doing, what the Israelis themselves, who are complicit in this, obviously, just as Germans were complicit in Nazism, you look at what they're doing, you point out the similarities. We change the word Israeli to Jew. This is how this works. These are the exact same tactics that were used against Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, by the way. Oh no, denazification is wrong. I would love to hear them explain this one too. Why is it wrong to re-educate Nazis after World War II to make sure that they don't want to genocide Jews or Eastern Europeans or anyone anymore? If that wasn't wrong, and honestly, it not only wasn't wrong, but it wasn't done enough, why would it be wrong to do the exact same to Israelis who hold those exact same sorts of views about Palestinians? I would love for you to explain that to me. Why is one form of racist, ethno-nationalist fascist somehow less bad than the other? Please tell me. These people are like, this is the type of person that makes the struggle of Palestinians look silly. Because of people like him, people who criticize Israel are called anti-Semites. People who criticize Israel are called anti-Semites because they've been called anti-Semites since the very fucking beginning. It's a strategy of Israel itself to invert who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed. Do you think that Palestinians don't call Israeli settler colonists? Do you think Palestinians don't think that all of Palestine is occupied, that every inch of Israel is Palestine? They do. How dare you try to say that me advocating for Palestine in the terms that Palestinians use is wrong? That just shows that you stand with the oppressed and not with the oppressor and not with the oppressed, okay? Let's look at what Palestinians think about Palestine, okay? Poll from the Washington Institute. Two-state solution. 26% of Palestinians in the West Bank and 36% in Gaza are open to a two-state solution as a compromise. However, 60% in both the West Bank and Gaza want one state, either binational or all being Palestine, from the river to the sea. Now, I don't know about you, but personally, I'm on the side of the oppressed, who are the Palestinians. I'll go along with whatever they want, with whatever they feel like is a goal that they are willing to sacrifice for. I'll go along with that. Palestinians do think that all of Israel is occupied by Israeli settlers, Israeli settler colonists. They denounce Israel in these terms. And if you don't denounce them in these same terms, you, my man, are an anti-Palestinianist. It is completely insane to be like, this person is a bad advocate for Palestinians. You make their struggle look silly when between us, you are so fucking far from the Palestinian struggle, from what they're aiming for what they're willing to sacrifice for. You do that cause a fucking disservice. All that I do is follow. I'm not leading. I do what they tell me. I advocate for what they want. What is this? This argument, this language has been modernized recently and therefore you're a Nazi is shallow. No, you're not a Nazi for speaking Hebrew. You are, however, if you are an Israeli, you are analogous to a Nazi settler in Poland. That is true, 100% true. I mean, if you don't want to deal with the truth, then you could always stop colonizing the Lebensraum that was stolen from Palestinian indigenous people by you, the settler colonist population. It's that simple. Like, they don't seem to understand why I was mentioning Hebrew in the first place, because the way that I knew that person was an Israeli, and they were an Israeli, by the way, they admitted they were an Israeli, just one who doesn't live in Israel anymore. So what? I don't live in Australia anymore, and they called me an Australian. The only reason I brought it up is because it was evidence, clear evidence that they were Israeli, and I was right, because 95% of the people who speak modern Hebrew are Israelis. It's very simple. But if you want to talk about the history of modern Hebrew, why is modern Hebrew so spoken, so concentrated in Israel? It's not just because Israel is a majority Jewish country. It's because it was a language specifically crafted for Israel. So let me go over the history here. There were two Hebrew revivalist movements in Palestine. One was the historical Jewish community had the Ottoman Empire force them to speak Hebrew because it didn't accept any other Jewish language as a national language, and to be a recognized nationality, you had to have a language. So religious Jews started speaking Hebrew among themselves. Before this, they had never spoken it before, when the Ottoman officials were around. And most of this is sourced from a great paper by a linguistic historian. I can't show it on the screen because you get, it's iffy to show like a paper on Twitch without just showing extracts from it as you would in an edited video essay. I don't think you're allowed to do it copyright-wise. But this is from a paper called Language and Nationalism, Modern Hebrew and the Zionist Project by Yaakov Rabkin, who is an Israeli Jew. So first the Ottomans forced Hebrew, which wasn't a language at this time, it was still just a liturgical language, on the religious Jewish population in Palestine who were there before the Zionist movement came up, because that was how they defined nationality. If they wanted minority rights, if they wanted to be a recognized minority, they had to have a language. So they were like, okay, we'll speak modern Hebrew. It's like, for example, if a bunch of Vatican priests decide to speak Latin between themselves. It's the same sort of thing. After that, the Zionist movement was created in Europe, where European Jews came up with this idea of making Jews into a nationality. Before this, Jews were not really a nationality. You could say they were an ethnicity, but they weren't conceived of in terms of like the European idea of a nationality, which was like a people with a specific homeland, a specific language, and a united history that's all exactly the same. You know, there were Jews in many different places who had very different cultures. You know, North African Jews, for example, were incredibly different to Jews living in Eastern Europe or Germany or whatever. The only thing they really shared was their religion and this conception that others had of them, like, you know, the sort of ethnic hatred, especially that Europeans had of Jews, that they didn't care about the differences between Jews. They saw them as one united race that they hated. The European Zionist idea was to unite Jews from everywhere into a Jewish state. At first, they didn't really know where this was going to be, and after a while, they settled on the historic Palestine for its religious connotation. And one of these Zionists, named Eliezer ben Yehuda, he was an instigator of the idea that this modern Jewish state should speak Hebrew, which was a very difficult idea to implement because Hebrew was a dead language, completely dead. Now, when I say dead language, I mean it wasn't spoken natively. It hadn't been spoken natively for about 1,700 years by this point. It was spoken liturgically, as in, like, rabbis, you know, people would read it. People would read the holy books in Hebrew. They would write a limited amount of literature in Hebrew. But no one could speak Hebrew natively. It was a dead language. Because when it comes to language linguistically, language is spoken. It's not written, right? So to say that a language is dead, it means that it doesn't have any native speakers. It means that it's no longer evolving naturally as languages do. That's why we can say, for example, English today is the same language as English from 1,000 years ago, even if we can't understand it, because it was part of an unbroken chain of linguistic, natural, spoken, natively spoken linguistic evolution. Modern Hebrew wasn't. Modern Hebrew was constructed by Ben Yehuda and other Hebrew revivalists in the same way that Esperanto was.
Communism
the only
is
meaningful difference here between Esperanto and modern Hebrew is that there is this emotional nationalistic narrative surrounding Hebrew. So, you know, they're never going to admit that it was constructed in the same similar way. So for modern Hebrew, you know, they took written vocabulary from books that they didn't know how to pronounce properly. They didn't even know what a lot of these words meant. They combined it with a ton of other vocabulary, grammar, etc. from other languages like Yiddish, Arabic, etc. They combined it with phonology from those languages as well. And they essentially created a drastically different language, absolutely nothing like what Hebrew was when it was actually spoken in the ancient world, and pretended that it was the same language. And the reason why they did that, and by the way, that was the same thing with Esperanto. Esperanto took vocabulary from other languages, it took grammar from other languages, it took phonology from other languages, it combined it all together to form something new. Functionally, in the terms of how these languages were constructed, that was the same thing. If you want to call modern Hebrew a reconstructed language, good for you. But at the end of the day, we're talking about two things that are the same in terms of how they were made. They were the same. The only reason for the distinction is essentially an emotional nationalistic one. That modern Hebrew is special. So you can't just call it the same as Esperanto. But in terms of the process of how this was actually done, it was exactly the same. If today, like, you know, someone took the Latin language and was like, oh, this is going to be the language of our new Christian ethno-state or something, and they took a bunch of Latin script, Latin words, etc., Latin grammar, mixed it with like Italian and Spanish or something in order to form a functional everyday language, that wouldn't be Latin. It would be a new language. So that's why there's a lot of Israeli scholars, a very influential minority, like 20-30%. And the only reason they're a minority is because obviously this is a very politicized thing in Israel. You can't call modern Hebrew a constructed language there. It's a taboo because it's a legitimizing force for the Zionist project. One of them is Gilad Zuckerman, who comes from a school of Israeli scholars, which is quite large, of linguistic scholars and linguistic historians, who argue that Israeli Hebrew is so different from liturgical and biblical Hebrew that regardless of how much Israelis imagine that it's the same language, as much as they like to imagine it as the same language for the purposes of legitimizing their settler colonial project, it's simply not. He thinks that it would be more accurately called Israeli. It's not anti-Semitic to acknowledge this. Like some people have said in response to me, oh, you're anti-Semitic because you're saying that it's illegitimate for the Jews to revive their language. No, I'm not. Language revival is a good thing overall. The way that modern Hebrew was constructed was very, like technically it was very impressive, very well done. It took a lot of skill, a lot of effort from many different people to do it. The thing is, it took a lot of skill and a lot of effort to build a Tiger tank. What was the Tiger tank for? The reason why modern Hebrew was constructed was quite alike to that Tiger tank, to legitimize the settler colonial replacement of Palestinians from their own homeland. That is why it's bad. I mean, I'm not saying it's bad to speak it. You speak whatever language you're taught, right? That's why, like, this project of building this language was bad, because it was done to legitimize a settler colonial project of genocide, of stealing land from the native Palestinians and creating a Jewish ethno-state on their land. That's why it was bad. It was just a part of Zionist ethno-nationalism, and they knew that. Now, another part of this that is very interesting is that, so someone else in this thread said here, the reason why apparently calling out modern Hebrew, well, not even calling out, just noting, right? The reason why I brought up modern Hebrew was not to do with anything that, and like any sort of denouncement of using the language or anything. It was just as an explanation for how I knew that person was Israeli, and I was right. Obviously, assuming someone's nationality or their citizenship based off the language that they speak is perfectly fucking normal. Okay, there's nothing racist about it. No one would ever call that racist in any other situation. At best, like, you might be speaking to someone who speaks that language as a second language, right? And they might not actually be from that country. You still wouldn't be a racist. You still would have been making a completely valid assumption. Assuming someone's nationality based on the language that they speak is a completely normal, everyday thing. It's not a negative or a positive thing. It's just a neutral idea. This person here says, ancient Hebrew has been continuously used by religious Jews every day for prayers and study for thousands of years to this day. Yeah, it has. That doesn't matter though. Ancient Hebrew is not the same thing as modern Hebrew. Ancient Hebrew is not spoken on a day-to-day basis between human beings. Ancient Hebrew is limited to religious use. Okay, these are not the same things. Modern Hebrew is not the same thing as liturgical or biblical Hebrew. They're not the same language. And bringing this up is especially bad because the motivations, one of the motivation was ethno-nationalism, as I brought it up. But the Jews who resurrected Hebrew and invented modern Hebrew, they did it as a rejection of the Jewish religion. They did it because they wanted to secularize what was previously considered to be a holy language. It was very much a negation of religious Judaism. It was very much, honestly, it seems they kind of hated religious Jews. Like, they were doing it because they knew that it would piss religious Jews off. And don't worry, I can back that up. So, remember the first Hebrew-speaking community in Palestine that I mentioned that was forced to speak Hebrew by the Ottoman authorities? The historian I mentioned earlier, Rabkin, notes that they stopped speaking Hebrew once secular Zionists started arriving from Europe and started promoting modern Hebrew. They stopped speaking Hebrew because they objected to they were only using it because they were forced to, but they objected to these secular Jews using or trying to resurrect modern Hebrew as an everyday language, like intentionally. They saw that as an attack on their religion, so they stopped speaking Hebrew. Even in Israel today, there are Orthodox Jewish communities, I believe the Haredi, the Haredi Jews, and many of their sects prohibit speaking modern Hebrew because they say it is a sacrilegious attempt to like sully, I don't know, I mean, it's really just shit. They see it as like a blasphemy against their holy language. They speak Yiddish. The religious institutions in Israel that have signs do not speak Hebrew here, okay? Well, do not speak modern Hebrew here at least, because you're only allowed to like read it off the page. And the Ben Yehuda, who I mentioned earlier, but the Ben Yehuda guy, he was very open about the fact that the reason why he was very interested in modern Hebrew specifically because he really hated religious Jews. He hated them. He wanted to secularize the Jewish people, turn them into like a European-style national unit without religion, basically. Turn them from basically like an ethno-religion into a nation. And I do have a good book on this. The Orthodox Jews of Jerusalem soon sensed that for Ben Yehuda, Hebrew was not a holy tongue, but a secular national tongue, and that his purpose for introducing spoken Hebrew was solely nationalist and political. They began to suspect him, and Ben Yehuda became an extremist in his anti-religious attitude. He registered as a national Jew without religion. That opposition from the Orthodox would color his entire career. Actually, it would outlast him. To this day, there are segments of the ultra-Orthodox world that see him as the enemy. They are appalled by his dishonesty. Did he really pretend to be one of them to advance his mission? This is a book by a Jewish scholar about the quote-unquote resurrection of Hebrew. The adoption of modern Hebrew was specifically chosen to legitimize an ethno-nationalist project of settler colonialism in Palestine. That is a fact. The idea was twofold. One, we are speaking, well, we believe that we are speaking, obviously it's not remotely the same language as people who lived here 2,000 years ago. Ergo, we have more of a claim to steal this land. And two, it was a means of attacking religious Judaism and trying to secularize Judaism. And yeah, Israel is not a religious extremist state. It's an ethnic supremacist state. So that's the construction of modern Hebrew. That is all historical fact. My sources for this are literally all Jewish scholars, okay? Well-regarded Jewish scholars too. Nothing about what I've said here is controversial, even in the slightest. The only thing that might be slightly controversial is using the word constructed instead of reconstructed. But functionally, those mean the same thing. The only difference is emotional. You see, there's all of that, and all of it's irrelevant to the question here, which was this idiotic post on Warsh's subreddit. The core question here has nothing to do with the construction of Hebrew. The core question here is, if you see someone speaking modern Hebrew conversationally, is it anti-Semitic to think that they are Israeli? The answer to that is no, okay? Conversational modern Hebrew is not the same thing as religious Jews elsewhere in the world who read Hebrew in, like, you know, the Torah or whatever, okay? Oh yeah, something that I forgot to mention is that the Jews already had their own languages even before this. They could have chosen, the Zionists could have chosen Yiddish, for example, or Ladino. The reason why they didn't choose these languages is because they hated those languages. They viewed Jews who lived in other countries as, like, weak and deserving of their oppression. So for them, this idea of choosing Hebrew as a language was in large part as well was a negation of what they called diaspora Jewish tradition. And Israel literally banned the use of Yiddish for a very long time because so many people who moved there, so many Jews who moved there, would keep speaking Yiddish. You know, they had like Yiddish newspapers and shit like that. And they considered this a threat because for them, the creation of Israel and the Zionist project in general was a rejection of the European, the Middle Eastern, etc. Jewish tradition and a creation of a new Jewish nationalist tradition. I'll quote Rabkin here, who said that the victory of Hebrew over Yiddish was not the triumph of one language over another, but rather of an ideology, a rejection of so-called exile, and the creation of a new Hebrew man.
Communism is based.
Now, there's obviously nothing wrong with speaking modern Hebrew if that's the language that you learned. It's no less valid than any other language that you speak. But it is important to understand how its connection with Israel, like with the Zionist project, functions. And it's also important to understand that if you see someone speaking modern Hebrew and you assume they're Israeli, you're obviously not being anti-Semitic in any way, shape, or form. It just doesn't make any sense unless you think it's racist to assume that someone who speaks Japanese is from Japan. That's an incredibly neutral thing. You know, the problem with Israel is obviously not that they speak modern Hebrew. If they did choose Yiddish, they would still be a terrible settler colonial state founded on the racial expulsion of Palestinians. But it's still definitely not wrong or anti-Semitic to bring up the fact that modern Hebrew is a constructed language or a reconstructed language or a revived language, however you want to call it. And that alone isn't a bad thing. But the bad thing about that, at least about it being constructed in this way, you know, past a certain point, you can't exactly control what language you're a native in. It's just whatever you were born into. But there are problematic aspects about why it was constructed, and pointing those out is not anti-Semitic in the slightest. I'm sorry, you have to be a complete fucking moron. And I think this is a great example of how like try to attack anyone who attacks Israel in entirely accurate terms, who looks at Israelis exactly the same as they look at people from other settler colonial nations. And they insist on this obviously ridiculous trick where they just change the word Israeli to Jew. That's how it works. And these people are anti-Palestinianists. That's how this is. If you equate denouncing the oppressors of the Palestinians with anti-Semitism, if you equate denouncing Israel or Israelis with anti-Semitism, you are anti-Semitic yourself. And you're also anti-Palestinianist, okay? It's really that simple. If we are not allowed to denounce Israel in the exact same terms that we denounce every single other settler colonial nation, if we're not allowed to denounce Israel in the exact same terms that Palestinians denounce Israel themselves, all you're doing there is policing the oppressed and their advocates on the side of the oppressor. You're inventing completely bullshit narratives, playing word games where you change words around completely to completely change the meaning of what's being said, to invert who the oppressor and the oppressed is in this relationship, and advocate for the oppressor against the oppressed. That is the fact. That is a fact. And I hope this complete and utter smackdown of these complete morons who think that them not knowing something, like I don't know anything about this, so it's anti-Semitic to if you dare say something that is literal historical fact. It's anti-Semitic if you say that someone who speaks the language that 95% is spoken by people in Israel, you are anti-Semitic. The next time that you hear a Chinese person speaking Chinese and you're like, oh, that guy's probably Chinese, remember that you are a racist. Remember that. That's how this works, apparently. Absolutely incredible stuff. But you really can't expect much from people who have never read a book in their lives and whose politics are really just based around attacking anyone who doesn't like their favorite internet personality. That's all there is to it.